I'm ready to work on the borders of my Lemoyne Star Quilt. So I'm ready to work on the border, and my grandson, when he picked out this pattern, of course wanted, mostly blue stars, but he also wants a blue border. And so I thought that that's a lot of blue right next to each other. And so I've decided to do the blue border, but I am going to add a little 1/4 inch border between the quilt top and the blue solid border. Now, I looked at different ways to do this. I looked into the faux flange, and that is kind of leaves like this would be a flap. And I didn't really want this to be a flap. I just, again, want like a little 1/4 inch. So I thought, well, if I want 1/4 inch showing, I need a 1/4 inch seam on this side and a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this side. Quilt math would tell you to cut 3/4 inch and, make that your border and sew it. But that seems like it might get a little wonky. 3/4 inch, I think, might stretch more. Anyways, I came across a border that someone had done on YouTube, like, I don't know, like 15 years ago or 12 years ago, with a really cool technique how to get a 1/4 inch border, not just sewing, 1/4 inch to the quilt and a 1/4 inch to the border. So I'm going to show you that technique. It's easier, but I need to start with 1 inch strips with the red. That gives a little bit more stability and a little bit more to work with. And then I'll show you this cool technique that I found. So I'm hoping that that is the ticket to my 2-tone border. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut strips the width that the pattern calls for. Then I will cut strips 1 inch wide of the red, and I am going to just sew them together with the diagonal, just like you would any border or binding, to get one long strip. Now this doesn't need one continuous strip because we have these white little cornerstones, so I only need a length that will, fit between the top and the bottom and then the sides, so the actual quilt measurement. But I am going to go ahead and sew this into one long continuous strip and then cut the lengths from that strip, as I need. And I will do that with both the blue and the red. So let me get those cut and we can move on to the borders. So it's been several months since I had talked about making the borders. I talked about, of course, having a very small 1/4 inch red to kind of go around the entire quilt to set the blue border against the blue stars kind of apart. And I am still doing that. I've had to make one change. I had mentioned that I was going to do cornerstones in the 4 corners that were originally going to be white. And so the border that I was going to make was just going to go across the top and the bottom and down the sides, and then the 4 cornerstones. I've had to change that because the video that I found with the technique that I'm going to use with this little tiny 1/4 inch border didn't talk about how to work on corners. And so I've had to I had to make up my own way to do the corner, and I wasn't sure I could do the cornerstones, so I've just eliminated those. So the border will just be the blue and the red around the entire quilt with no cornerstones. Now, with that being said, I have my large blue borders cut to 2.5 inches, and I have the small borders cut to 1 inch. And I do need to still piece these all together. I will join these like you would any binding or borders. And I will do all the red in one long strip, all the blue in one long strip, and then I will just cut what I need as I'm working on the borders. And this will be just the same way that you would, again, do any kind of joining, where I will put them at a 90-degree angle. I will sew a diagonal, and then when that's folded back, that will just make the continuous binding, or border in my case, and it will have a diagonal seam so that it won't be so bulky. So that's what I will do with the red and the blue to make long strips. Now, I will not sew these together as I had originally planned, because that is not going to be the technique that I'm going to use. So let me show you a little sample that I just came up with. Again, most of my stars will be blue, but here you can see against the white that this little red is a 1/4 inch border that will be between the stars and the border. Of course, again, my border will be blue, but this is the general look of the border. Again, I had to kind of make up my own corner, and so I'm going to show you. This is a super easy, fun technique, and it's different than anything I had come across. I had mentioned earlier about cutting these to 3/4 of an inch, so that you would sew a 1/4 of an inch to the outer border, a 1/4 of an inch to the quilt, the star, and then that would leave you with a 1/4 inch border. And I found that that's not as easy as it sounds, I guess. And so this method gives a little bit of stability to this little 1/4 inch border. Now on the back, it's going to look a little bit confusing right now, and I'm going to show you how easy and fun this technique is, and it gives you a sturdy border that just isn't a 1/4 inch border with, 2 1/4 inch seams on the side. So this is what my corner will look like, and I'm going to show you how easy this is. I can't wait to get this finished so that I can get this quilted for my grandson. So that's what I'm going for, with, of course, the colors that I've chosen. So my first step is to, again, piece all of the red together. Then I will piece all of the blue together, and we'll go from there. So let's get started. So to put these border strips together, I am going to be putting right sides together. Now both of my fabrics, this batik fabric and this solid, really don't have a right or wrong. So for me, it's not going to matter. But of course, if you're using just regular, quilter's cotton, you will put right sides together. And also on this batik, this doesn't really look like it, but these are both selvage edges. And you can see right here, if I hold this up, you can see that there is a line where the top is darker, and that is the selvage. So you can see about where that selvage ends, and of course the same on this. So when I put my strips together, they're going to be 90 degrees. Now, if I did not have selvages, I could easily just line them up right in the corner. And that's probably the easiest way. But because I have, again, selvages, I need to go up about 1/2 inch above, because I don't want any of that selvage in my binding or my border. And I need to move this strip over so that I'm past this selvage. So again, you can cut those off. It might make it easier to line up, but it's honestly just as easy to do it this way. So now I would have right sides together, making sure the selvages are not going to be in, my seam allowance. And then I am going to just flip this so that I can sew from where these two meet up here down to where they meet at the bottom. Now you could pin or clip, take a ruler and draw a line. This is really pretty short, and so if I put my needle down, I can put this little V where those two meet, I can put it right up and then lower my presser foot, and then I can just aim for this point down here. It's pretty short, and I can probably do a pretty good job just eyeing it and sewing. But again, you can always mark that if that's feels a little bit more comfortable. So let's get this first stitched out. Now after stitching, I will just take this top piece and I will find the end. Again, for me, I do need to pay attention from here on out because I need to make sure that I'm treating the correct size, because I don't have technically a right or wrong size. I can't just take either side because then my seams might not be all on one side. So if I take this would be considered my wrong side because it's facing up and the right sides are together. And if I take this strip and run it down, this is up, and so it is my wrong side. However, it needs to be right side up, so I need to flip this over and add another strip. Now the next strip that I add, it won't matter what's right or wrong because it's not attached to anything. So I will do the same thing where I put this above so that the selvages are up and out of the way, and then I will just continue sewing, and I will do that and sew all of my blue strips together. So once they're all sewn together and clipped apart, they will look like this, and I am going to go press them. So this will just fold back, and I will press, and you can see that just becomes a continuous piece. And I will trim this 1/4 of an inch, and I will press these seams open. And so then I have the border attached and one long strip, and I again will just cut as I need them to put around the quilt. So I'm going to go get these pressed and cut. Now that I have both of my borders pieced together and I have the one long continuous strip that I can use for all 4 of the edges of my quilt, I am going to first do the sides of the quilt, the long lengthwise edges. And so I'm a new quilter, and I know that some people will just take their border and start at the top and just sew it and cut at the end. The way that I think you're supposed to technically is you are supposed to take measurements to get an average of the quilt so that you can cut both, for example, side borders the exact same length. And then let's say one edge or one side is 1/4 of an inch smaller than the other side. Your borders will still be the same length, and you will just adjust whether you need to ease your quilt top in. You might have to, if it's a little bit short, stretch it to match with the borders. But then when those side borders, for example, are both put on, the side border will measure the same. So that keeps the quilt square. So I think that that's what I'm going to do. Again, I'm a new quilter, so I'm going to try my best to keep this square. So I am going to measure, I think you're supposed to measure the center of the quilt to determine the length of your border. And then I am going to measure the size, and hopefully I'm pretty darn close. So I haven't done that yet. But my first step after I determine the length of my red border is to sew with 1/4 inch seam down each of the sides. So I will just, again, have this cut to size. I will pin and just sew right to my stars, my quilt top, and sew this 1-inch piece, 1/4 inch seam allowance on both edges. So that's my first step. One more note about the outer border when I am stitching this little thin inner border, the way that I'm going to be stitching it. And again, I know it's a little bit confusing looking at it because it's not just the typical 1/4 inch on each side of this red inner border. But I do want to note that because the way I am stitching it, this outer border needs to have 1/4 inch added if you want the border the size that, say, the pattern that you're working on. And by that I mean on my quilt, the border is cut to 2.5 inches. This is 2.5 inches. And so when I would typically do a border, I would sew 1/4 inch, on one side, and then this would be for the binding. And then I would end up with a 2-inch outer border. However, because of the way this inner border is sewn, in order to keep that 2-inch finished border, I would need to cut this at 2 3/4 instead of 2.5. And so that's just something to note. I did not change my measurement. My measurement of the outer border is still 2.5 inches. So when I add my binding, my border will actually be about 1 3/4 inches. I'm not worried about that. I'm actually doing the same blue that I'm doing for the outer border for the binding. And so I'm, not too worried that my outer border will be a little bit smaller. But that's just to note that if you want this specific to, let's say, a pattern you're using, but you're adding this thin border, you would need to take into account that you would need to add an extra 1/4 inch. So I hope that that will make a little bit more sense when we go over the whole board, both border parts. But it is time to go ahead and sew my 1-inch red border to the quilt top. So let's get going on that. I have the sides of my borders clipped on right sides together. I left a little bit extra. However, I measured the center of my quilt, and luckily my two long edges were the same measurement. And so I did mark that measurement and line it up. But I just left a couple extra inches just, I don't know, just in case. So my quilt in the center measured 64 3/8. And so I have pinned along both long edges. This is the 1-inch red border, and I am just going to sew 1/4 inch down each side to attach these to the quilt top. After sewing both the side borders on, I'm going to press just to kind of set the seam. And then I'm just going to fold this border over so that the seam allowance will face the border. So I'm going to finish both edges, and then I'm going to measure the width of my quilt and mark and clip on the top and bottom border pieces and do exactly the same thing. I will sew 1/4 of an inch, set the seam, and then press it towards the red border. So then all 4 edges of the quilt will have this 1-inch border on. So once I had the border, all 4 borders around and pressed, remember I didn't cut mine exactly to size. I had just measured them and then pinned them, so I had some extra fabric on the ends. So what I did is I just took a ruler, and now this 1-inch piece, because we did 1/4 of an inch seam, will be 3/4 of an inch. And so to just make sure I was square, I lined up my 3/4 inch line right along the seam of that red. And then you can line it up with the 1-inch, at least on my ruler, and then I cut that edge. And then if I needed to cut this edge, some I had pre-cut and some I didn't. Anyways, then I could move this down, still lining the 3/4 inch up, and it would be 3/4 of an inch along here. I don't really have a marking this way on my ruler, so that's how I just made sure that my corners were square. So now that we have all of the corners on, and this was just a regular border, nothing, different about this. It's just 1/4 of an inch seam. I did the sides again first, and then the top and the bottom. So this is actually the top. This would be the top right. The top and the bottom will be longer. So now what I need to do is attach my blue border. So what I'm going to do is just attach it like normal. I'm going to line it up like normal, I should say. I'm just going to see right sides together, and I will just line it up with that red. I'll probably go a little bit extra just so I can, double check when I square up the corners. So I'll put a little bit over, line it up with the red, and then I will clip it. On this one, I don't think I'm going to measure. I think I'm just going to make sure that I don't stretch either this side or this, and just make sure that it's, as non-stretched as I can get it. And so again, normally to put on a border, you would just do 1/4 of an inch. But if I were to do 1/4 of an inch and flip this, I'm going to have a big 1/2 inch wide border, and I don't want that. But I didn't want a little skinny piece to do that with, if you remember the first part of the video. So now this is where this really cool trick comes in. So what I'm going to do, instead of sewing it like this, again, like you normally would, so 1/4 of an inch, I am going to flip this over. So I'm going to have to start, at the other end. And now, again, instead of sewing 1/4 of an inch right here, I am going to sew 1/4 of an inch from the seam that I just sewed the red to, which in a perfect world would line up right with the edge of the top of the quilt. My edges weren't perfect, so I'm going to have to, I have some pieces here you can see that are probably a little bit thinner. And so I'm thinking about measuring a 1/2 inch down and making a line, but essentially you are sewing 1/4 of an inch from the seam that you just sewed. And that is how you get this little 1/4 of an inch. So now this might make a little bit more sense. So putting on these borders, so this is the same as my blue border. I have the red underneath, and I've just lined up the border with the red that I just sewed on. But you can see it's not 1/4 of an inch. It's actually a 1/2 inch. And that's because when I sew this, you can see right here, I sewed right along this edge, which is 1/4 of an inch. Again, in a perfect world, if this was straight, this edge of the quilt was straight, you would just sew literally just to the right of this seam allowance or the stitch that I just made. So this now might make, again, a little bit more sense. So I'm sewing right here. If I flip this back, you can see here is my 1-inch red border that I just put on. Here is the 1/4 of an inch that I just sewed it to the quilt top, which is what I have right here. And then I'm putting on my border piece, lining it up with the red, and sewing not 1/4 of an inch from the edge, but 1/4 of an inch from the stitching that I just sewed it on with, which again, in a perfect world, will be right to the right of this 1/4 inch seam allowance. So then when I go to open this up, this border, I now have that 1/4 inch little inside border. I have a nice non-wobbly border because I've got some structure to it, and it's just a really fast way to do this border. And here's another angle of the other side, so you can see that here is my original 1-inch border. I sewed it on to the quilt top with this 1/4 inch seam, which then again was pressed towards the red, which is what I have here. Put my border on, lined it up with the red. But then, so it would be sewn, down. Then again, instead of stitching 1/4 of an inch like we do 99.999% of the time, I stitched the 1/4 inch from this seam allowance. And that, again, is what gives me this little tiny border that's got a little bit more stability. And I didn't have a little tiny piece that I just had to sew. Again, the back looks different, but that is how I'm going to sew. I'm going to get this cute little border. So what I'll do is I will start again with the side edges, the long edges, and that is the side, the top and the bottom are the longer pieces of red. So I'll sew this side first, the 2 long edges, and I will do the same thing. I'll flip, and then I can put the next border. Of course, I do both of them, and then I'd put I would cut this even with the red, and I will use my ruler to square up that corner, and then I can place the next border on top and do exactly the same thing, which is what I've done here. So this would be my long edge. Once that was done and trimmed, then I was able to put the top and the bottom on. All right, so let's go finish off the top of this quilt. So I think what I'm going to do to try to line up my 1/4 of an inch, again, since my seam allowance isn't the greatest around the entire quilt, this is my little sample. So I put a different foot on, and here's the seam that put the red border on, and I need to sew 1/4 of an inch. And again, on the sample, I was just able to follow this actual fabric to stitch the border on. But what I'm going to do, I think, is I moved my needle to the right to line up with the stitching of the original seam, this one right here, to right along the inside toe of this foot. So as I stitch my blanket, I'll just keep this seam along the inside toe of this foot, and that should stitch 1/4 of an inch. And that's how I'm going to try. So I'm going to try that on the first side of my quilt, and we'll see how it goes. But I think that might be how I'm going to do this entire quilt, since again my seam allowances weren't quite as even as this little sample was. All right, so I'm going to start the first side. So all of my borders are done and I love it. I think it turned out really great. I squared up the corners, and I do want to note that there were a few spots when I was ironing that the red border was bigger than the 1/4 inch, and you could tell that it was bigger. And here's a spot right here. And so what I did is, you can see there's 2 lines of stitches. So when I was pressing this, it was bigger, and I could tell, even though it's like a needle width apart, you could definitely tell it wasn't the right amount. So for that little section, you can see that's about right here. I went back in and, back stitched, did a better job at lining up with my stitching on the left, and you can see that now it's a little bit to the inside of that original stitching. And then I ended when you can see where it comes back into the stitching. So I had a few spots like that around the quilt. I think 3 that were just little pieces like that. But now that section is the correct size. I love this, and I'm excited to get the top quilted and get this to my grandson. So this was a fun first quilt project.